Welcome back. If you're joining us for the first time, this series explores core insights from mid 20th century sociology, particularly systems thinking and the structural functionalist tradition. These ideas were central to sociology in the mid 20th century. Our goal is to bring them back into the conversation as an essential perspective that helps explain how order is maintained, how groups adapt, and how pressure for change can be utilized for stability. These ideas help us better understand how society works and how we, as individuals, can navigate the systems around us. Sociology offers a powerful way to understand stability, interdependence, function, and dysfunction, concepts that are incredibly useful for anyone trying to make sense of the world. Each episode is just a starting point, an introduction that scratches the surface of the ideas. The goal is to spark your curiosity and invite you to explore the foundations of the discipline more deeply. If you haven't watched episode 1, I encourage you to go back and start there. We introduced key ideas like social systems and Parsons' AGIL model, key concepts for understanding how groups remain stable over time. In this episode, we'll shift focus from the structure of systems to some of the individual action within them. We're going to explore the dynamic relationship between social structures and human agency, especially when things go wrong or unexpectedly right. How do we explain the gap between what we intended and what actually happened? We'll explore these concepts of unintended consequences, the habits and dispositions we absorb, and the idea that individual action is usually shaped by our particular social context. Our goal is not to strip away personal responsibility, but to deepen our understanding of how structure and choice interact. Let's begin. To introduce concepts about the complex relationship between individual choice and social structures, we'll draw on the work of three major sociologists, Norbert Elias, Robert Merton, and Pierre Bourdieu. Each of these thinkers offers a unique perspective on how human behavior is shaped and how human behavior in turn shapes society. Let's start with Norbert Elias. Born in Germany in 1897, Elias was both a historian and a sociologist. His most famous work, The Civilizing Process, published in German in 1939, looked at how patterns of behavior and emotion regulation evolved in Western Europe over centuries. But for our purposes today, his concept of figuration is key. Figuration refers to the dynamic networks of interdependent individuals who form a social web. Elias emphasized that individuals are not isolated units, but always part of interdependent chains of relationships. In one of his later works, Elias argued that it's actually misleading to separate the individual from society. He asked us to view social life as a constantly shifting pattern of interconnections. Next, Robert Merton, born in 1910 in the US, was a key figure in American sociology. As a student of Talcott Parsons, Merton is widely known for bridging abstract theory and empirical research. His most famous works include Social Theory and Social Structure, written in 1949, plus numerous influential essays. In this episode, we'll focus on his concept of the unintended consequences of purposive action, the idea that even well-intended actions can have effects that no one anticipated, or at least that no one wanted. Merton's work provides a foundation for thinking carefully about how complex systems respond to change. Finally, we'll look briefly at Pierre Bourdieu, a French sociologist born in 1930. Bourdieu's major contributions include outline of a theory of practice, distinction, and the logic of practice. For this episode, our focus will be on his concept of habitus. Each of these thinkers adds a valuable layer to our understanding of how structure and agency interact. Elias helps us see interdependence, Merton helps us understand consequences, and Bourdieu helps us grasp how social experience is then carried forward. And importantly, recognizing that actions happen within systems doesn't mean we let go of individual responsibility. This work doesn't say people have no choice. Rather, as leaders, educators, or parents, we can try to understand systems in order to make it easier to do the right thing, more intuitive, and less like swimming upstream. To begin, let's define structural functionalism, a major school of thought in the mid-20th century. Structural functionalism views society as a complex system whose parts work together to promote stability and order. You can think of it as a problem-solving entity. These parts, institutions like family, education, religion, and the economy, are seen as interdependent structures, each serving particular functions that help maintain the larger social system. This framework dominated sociology for much of the 1940s and 50s, especially in the United States. However, in the 1960s and 70s, it came under criticism for appearing too conservative, for downplaying conflict and inequality, and for implying that existing institutions were naturally good or necessary. Critics, especially those aligned with conflict theory and neo-Marxism, argued that functionalist thinking ignored power struggles and the interests of dominant groups. In the process, many valuable insights about interdependence, stability, and social systems were discarded. As the saying goes, the baby was thrown out with the bathwater to a certain extent. In this series, we're revisiting those earlier insights because they still help us understand how society operates. Now, let's turn to two foundational concepts: structure and agency. Structure refers to the enduring patterns, arrangements, and institutions that shape our behavior. These include social institutions like schools, families, churches, which we'll be talking about more later, cultural norms like shared values and beliefs, and social hierarchies. Structures provide this scaffolding for social life. They shape opportunities, expectations, and even our own self-understanding. They're not easily changed by individual will alone, but they're not static either. They're produced, reproduced, and sometimes challenged by individuals. Agency, on the other hand, is the capacity of individuals to act independently and make choices. Agency involves intention, decision-making, and the ability to influence one's circumstances. However, agency is always exercised within a structural context. When people act, they do so from a particular position, with particular tools, and in a particular setting. Sociology emphasizes that structure and agency are recursive. That is, they influence one another in a feedback loop. Structures shape our behavior, but our behaviors also create and reinforce or alter those structures over time. Think of it like this: we walk along well-trodden paths, but every step we take also contributes to making those paths. Norbert Elias's concept of figuration identified this interdependence explicitly. He encourages us to see social life not as a collection of isolated individuals in a static environment, but as a dynamic network. Imagine a parent and child, or a teacher and student. Their actions, their next behaviors are shaped by interactions with each other in ways that then affect the relationship, which then in turn shapes how each behaves. Neither is completely independent nor completely controlled. Embedded in their action is the context that played a role in this current behavior, which will then shape the future environment interaction. Rather than seeing individuals or societies as isolated units, he emphasized how people are constantly shaped by and shaping the web of relationships they're part of. The practical relevance of this idea is enormous. In any group, workplaces, families, teams, what one person does often depends on how others have behaved, and vice versa. When we understand these patterns of interdependence, we become better at navigating them. We stop seeing situations and people in isolation and start looking at the relationships and contexts that interact to produce them. And importantly, these effects that become causal factors contributing to people's responses are not always expected or predictable. And this brings us to unintended consequences. Robert Merton's work adds another layer. He originally used the phrase unintended consequences of purposive action, though today we often say unintended consequences. The idea is simple but profound. People act with particular goals in mind, but those actions often produce results no one expected, and sometimes that no one wanted. Let's start with a light example. Consider the introduction of automatic flushing toilets. These were designed for cleanliness and convenience, but an unintended consequence, they sometimes flush at inopportune times, not only wasting water, but also startling users. That might be minor. But when we look at large-scale systems, unintended consequences can be much more serious. Robert Merton outlined 5 key reasons why unintended consequences occur. The first one is ignorance, simply not knowing enough about how the system works. We can't always predict the future. We can't know every single variable involved in a situation. There's a certain amount of what we call bounded rationality. Think of someone introducing a non-native species to control pests with no information about why that would be a problem, only to discover later that it disrupts the entire ecosystem. Another possibility is error. In other words, we have the information, but we don't use it wisely. We make incorrect assumptions, or there's misunderstandings about cause and effect. People might believe that a certain policy will reduce crime because it did somewhere else, but we fail to adequately analyze the data. A third possibility is immediate interest overriding long-term interest. Short-term goals becoming prioritized over long-term goals. So a decision benefits someone in the short term, but causes problems later. For example, overusing antibiotics can yield short-term health benefits, but contributes to antibiotic resistance. Fourth, basic values. Sometimes values cause people to overlook or ignore consequences. For example, a company might value efficiency or extra profit so highly that it implements automation or moves factories overseas without regard for what happens to displaced workers. Fifth, self-defeating prophecies. You may be aware of the self-fulfilling prophecy idea. A self-defeating prophecy occurs because something is spoken about or some attention is brought to an issue that is expected to happen, but because of talking about the issue or because of bringing people's attention to the issue, it actually doesn't happen. Oftentimes, this is a positive development, but maybe not always. A classic example is the Y2K scare. So there was enough attention brought to the possibility that we would have widespread infrastructure failure. Enough people sprung into action that, after all, Y2K did not develop as a problem. So understanding these mechanisms and these possible reasons for why unintended consequences could occur gives us tools to anticipate better and to avoid preventable harm. Systems thinking might not eliminate all surprises, but it can help reduce some avoidable ones. Finally, we turn to Pierre Bourdieu and his concept of habitus, a term that may sound abstract, but has practical everyday relevance, as we'll see coming up in our case study. Habitus refers to deeply ingrained habits, skills, and ways of perceiving the world that individuals acquire, often through their upbringing and social experiences. Think of it as a kind of internalized map, a set of dispositions that shape how we think and act and respond, often without realizing it. Bourdieu saw habitus as a mechanism through which social structure is carried inside us. It's formed through repeated exposure to certain social environments, our families, schools, neighborhoods, peer groups. Over time, these experiences almost become embodied. They shape our posture, language, our sense of what's appropriate and natural to us, so that we can walk into a technically new environment. But because of our prior experience, we already have a feel for the game. This doesn't mean individuals can't change or adapt. It just means our behavior is not only a matter of conscious decision making. We will find ourselves needing to change and adapt, perhaps. We move through the world with dispositions shaped by our past. These dispositions feel like common sense, but what's common depends on your context. This concept offers a powerful way to understand both subtle social advantages and the friction people face when trying to enter unfamiliar situations. For example, someone who appears awkward or disengaged might simply lack familiarity, not motivation or competence or potential. Bourdieu's work provides a bridge between structure and agency. Habitus is structured by our past, but also structures our present and future actions. It makes some choices feel more likely or more thinkable than others. And this brings us back to a big question of this episode. How can we support individual responsibility without ignoring some social structural contexts that shape it? As we look ahead to episode 3, we'll dive even deeper into culture, how meanings, values, and traditions are passed down and transformed. Culture is one of the most powerful forces shaping both structure and habitus, and understanding it will help us further explore how societies change or remain stable. Let's turn now to a real-world example to bring these concepts to life. At a mid-sized congregation in a growing suburban town, the leadership team noticed something troubling. The number of teens participating in their youth group had dropped significantly over the past 2 years. Many families still attended services, but their teenagers were disengaged, some even attending programs at other churches, or none at all. In response, the leadership launched a new mentorship-based youth program. The intention was clear: create a space where teens felt seen, heard, and guided by caring adults. The structure reflected traditional expectations. Meetings were held on Wednesday evenings in the church basement. Dress was modest and semi-formal, and activities followed a fairly rigid structure: a prayer, a short Bible lesson, and then small group reflection. The leadership hoped to offer moral grounding, spiritual community, and consistency. At first, the results were mixed. A few teens showed up, mostly those already comfortable in church settings, but engagement lagged. Adults reported struggling to connect with students who seemed distracted or disinterested. The leaders recognized that they were meeting their goal in form, but not in substantive outcome. After several months, they made a bold decision. They restructured the program around feedback from the teens. Meetings were moved to Saturday evenings, held in the more relaxed fellowship hall, and designed with a more casual tone: sofas, snacks, music, and open discussion. Adult mentors were trained to listen first rather than teach. The group still included prayer and values-based conversations, but the overall feel shifted dramatically. The change worked. Participation climbed steadily, and the room began to buzz with energy. Teens who had once avoided the group began bringing friends. Some came from other churches, drawn by the welcoming atmosphere. Others had no religious background at all, but found the space comforting and fun. The church celebrated. Their mentorship model was working. They had adapted successfully. But, as Merton might have predicted, the story didn't stop there. A few longtime members of the church, particularly older adults who had been mentors in their earlier iteration, felt increasingly disconnected. Some quietly stopped attending the youth gatherings. Others expressed discomfort with the informality or the music choices. They worried that something meaningful was being lost. Meanwhile, the presence of teens from other churches and unchurched backgrounds began to influence the culture of the group. Topics of conversation shifted. Language norms changed. While the church had emphasized open dialogue, a few discussions stirred concerns. Differing views on morality, social issues, and theology caused tension. A couple of families ultimately decided to leave the church, their children now drawn to congregations more aligned with their new friends. Yet another shift occurred when the youth group's success began to draw young families to the church, people who were excited by its modern, adaptive spirit. The church's demographic began tilting younger. This sparked both enthusiasm and unease within the broader congregation. These were unintended consequences. The original goal was not to shift the entire character of the church, but to reconnect with teens. Now let's bring in habitus. Among the youth, these dynamics were particularly visible. One teen had grown up in a different church where traditions were emphasized, dress codes, formal prayers, memorized scripture. Jordan, we'll call him. Jordan walked into the new group and instantly knew what to say and how to behave. Adults quickly identified him as a leader, but his participation was shallow. He echoed what he knew would sound right, but rarely opened up or engaged beyond the surface level. He actually ended up having what some leaders felt were some of the most negative influences on the youth, despite being able to look and act the part of a teen leader. Another teen, Alicia, came from a secular household. She was curious, thoughtful, and spiritually open, but unfamiliar with church settings. She mispronounced common phrases, sometimes asked questions that startled the group, and dressed casually. At first, she was seen as awkward, but over time, mentors realized her interest was sincere. She was just navigating a new cultural field. This illustrates Bourdieu's point. Social competence is not the same as sincerity or intelligence. People often interpret ease in a setting as a sign of merit, when it might simply be the result of familiarity. Habitus shapes who blends in and who feels like an outsider, even when intentions and capabilities are equal. Finally, let's bring Elias back in. The shifting dynamic in the congregation illustrates figuration, the evolving web of interdependent roles and relationships. As teens changed, mentors adapted. As mentors adapted, the teens responded. Church culture shifted. As the church culture shifted, families responded. Each action fed back into the system, producing outcomes that were both positive and complicated. This story isn't about failure or success. It's about recognizing the structure-agency dynamic in real life. The church acted with intention. People made choices. But those choices were shaped by larger structures, as well as interactions whose results weren't always intuitive, and which in turn reshaped those very structures. If church leadership had approached the youth group challenge with a sociological lens from the outset, they might have, better anticipated the chain of effects their decisions would set in motion. Elias's concept of figuration, especially when seen through the lens of recursion, highlights how every action taken within a social group feeds back into the system, shaping the very environment in which the next action takes place. With this recursive view, leaders might have built in space for ongoing feedback, identified fragile links in the social web like older mentors, and planned for adaptive cycles rather than one-time fixes. Merton's idea of unintended consequences might have prompted them to ask not only what do we hope this change will do, but also what might this change set in motion, especially among those not directly targeted. And if they had understood Bourdieu's habitus, they might have trained adult mentors to look beyond surface behaviors and recognize that ease in a social setting often reflects familiarity, not deeper engagement. With those tools, they still might have chosen the same reforms, but with more foresight, better support for displaced members, and a stronger grasp of how change spreads through interdependent relationships. To wrap up, here are a few questions to help you reflect on the ideas we've introduced in episode 2. Number 1, when have you seen consequences occur that were not intended and perhaps even contrary to the intentions of the action, rule, or decision? Number 2, have you ever made a decision that had unintended ripple effects in a group or organization? What was your intention at the time, and what unexpected outcomes emerged? Looking back, do you think those outcomes could have been predicted, prepared for, or even prevented? Number 3, when have you noticed confidence or fluency in a social setting being mistaken for deeper traits like sincerity, leadership, or technical competence? And finally, how do you see the concept of figuration helpful for thinking about long-term consequences of interactions with others? As we continue this series, remember that sociology doesn't just ask what happened, it also asks what conditions made that outcome more or less likely. How do individual actions connect to the broader systems that they shape and create? Thanks for exploring these questions with me. In the next episode, we'll look at the role of culture in shaping our shared experiences and how tradition, meaning, and values move through time.